So there are lots of stories in the Bible that are designed to help us understand who we are and who God is. One reason a lot of us are here at church in the first place is to figure that out. Who are we? We want to know. And who is God? We want to know. And how does that relationship work? Are we loved? Are we accepted just as we are? Is that really possible? Well, here every Sunday, we make an affirmation to start off our worship service. No matter who you are or where you've been on life's journey, you're welcome here. That is not something that just popped into our heads one day. It's based on how we read the Bible and how we understand God's wide welcome of us. But where specifically does that idea come from that we're loved and accepted just as we are, no matter what? But we know it's actually a rather rare thing to claim in most organized religions that we welcome and embrace anyone and everyone. So, how does that really work? I think one story opens the door for us to answer the question better than other stories, or at least it's a story that invites us inside to learn the answer. Parable of the prodigal son. It's one of three stories in a row that Jesus tells after Pharisees and scribes have taken him to task for associating with certain kinds of people. Those religious leaders are angry because Jesus isn't merely associating with lepers and tax collectors and women of ill repute. He is openly defying Jewish dietary laws by eating with those people. And he's not content with dining privately in their ritually unclean homes. He's going well beyond that by returning their hospitality and receiving them as his guest, as any host would receive anyone. This is so galling to the Pharisees and scribes because they're the God-fearing believers who they don't just talk about their faith, they live it out by respecting God's laws to the letter. Now, it's not an easy life, but they do it anyway because it sets a good example for everyone else. It's not as if the scribes and Pharisees don't care either about the people they consider to be sinners. They care about them. They simply feel that the best way to help them is to hold a high standard of behavior. And if you fall short of that standard, you simply try again to be the best you can be. Now, some people have what it takes, some tragically do not. And it's just best not to mix the two. And that's an appealing message. There are rules and there are rewards for those who obey the rules. And, well, for those who don't, well, they either try again, or they're obviously not cut out. They're not interested in being among the righteous, so they get what they deserve. So that's what the Pharisees did. And I have to admit that sometimes they sound like my kind of people. I have to admit that with some pain and embarrassment, but to be honest, I do have to admit it. Many years ago, I was in my car at a stoplight. A man was standing at the intersection holding up a tattered cardboard sign, and it read, "Homeless, hungry, needs sleeping bag, please help. No drugs or booze." Well, my son Charlie was in the car with me. He was about 4 years old at the time. And he asked me what the man's sign said. And so I read it to him. And he said, "Well, why is that man standing out on the street all day?" Seizing the opportunity to teach my young son an important life lesson, I said, "Well, you see, Charlie, while we really don't know anything about that man or what might be going on in his life, we also know that usually, if people are willing to work, there is work out there for them." And as soon as those words left my mouth, the guy in the car parked in line in front of me reached out and handed the man a $5 bill. And I suddenly realized what I had said to Charlie. Ay, ay, ay. And I looked at my reflection in the rearview mirror and I said, "Great life lesson, Mr. Pharisee." Still, it's easy to see where the scribes and Pharisees are coming from. They have a way of understanding who they are and who God is that makes a lot of sense. Pretty simple system, right and wrong, cause and effect. But then Jesus comes along, starts messing around with that system, treating sinners like they were special. even socializing with them of all things, which in the eyes of the scribes and the Pharisees, that was as good as condoning bad behavior and therefore robbing sinners of any motivation to pull themselves up by their own sandal straps and do better. Why should you even try to elevate people if Jesus is going around treating everyone as equal? And in response to their disapproval, Jesus doesn't argue with the scribes and the Pharisees. Instead, he tells them three stories, all with the same basic plot line, but it's the one at the end that really packs a wallop. And we know those stories as the parables of the lost sheep, parable of the lost coin, and the parable of the prodigal son. In each one of those stories, something is lost, then it's found, and then there is much rejoicing. Now, in the first two stories, the thing that was lost might be a little hard for us to identify with. We can't identify very well with sheep because, well, they're dumb as dirt. And it's not a lot easier to identify with a coin. I mean, that's an inanimate object. But almost all of us can identify, at least in some measure, with a son who goes off and sows his wild oats, runs out of money, finds himself in the pits, and comes back home because he has nowhere else to turn. Not that any of us ever acted that way, but we've all known someone who has. Thing is, we're not really supposed to identify with the younger son in this story because remember, we're listening to this story, which means we're all scribes and Pharisees. We would never run off with our father's inheritance and do those kinds of shameful things. Now, in each story, we're not being asked to identify with what was lost, but to discover a new connection with the one who's doing the finding. After all, Jesus doesn't begin this story by saying there was once a man who had a father and a brother. No. He says there was a man who had two sons. So it's the father. It's the father who's the main character here, not the sons. And the father is the one we need to pay attention to because that is who the scribes and the Pharisees were paying attention to, believe me. They also may have related to the plight of the older brother. They could relate to that, but they really paid attention here to the father's behavior. You know, in that time and place, the son running away, first taking his inheritance, well, you know, that was, just wasn't done. Symbolically, that was more or less the same thing as wishing his father was dead. And when the son had squandered everything, he comes up with a pretty calculated confession designed to get him back in his father's good graces, with a roof over his head, food in his belly, so that, in other words, he can now live off his brother's inheritance, the good brother, the one who stayed home. But no sooner did his father see this bad son coming up the road than the elder brother's prized possession, his fatted calf, was killed, and the party was on. There was no heart-to-heart talk between the father and the runaway son, no extra chores, no, now go to your room for a week and think about what you've done. No. Just a clean robe for his back, a fine ring for his finger, new sandals for his feet. Didn't even wait for the older son to return home from his work. He's out working, doing what he's supposed to do. He didn't wait for him to come home before starting the party. So the older brother comes home to the sound of music and dancing and the very familiar aroma of his own calf. And I'm glad I'm not the one who had to tell him what the party was all about. If you're an older sibling, you can probably relate to this. Honestly, is there anything wrong with facing the consequences of your actions? What about reaping what you sow? What kind of world would this be if we all made a practice out of rewarding sinners while we God-fearing folks are still out there working in the field? What have you got to do to get a party around here? You have to go off and squander your inheritance before you can come home and be embraced and kissed and assured that you belong? Listen, the older son said to the father, for all these years I've been working like a slave for you, and I've never disobeyed a command. And you've never given me so much as a young goat so that I might celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours comes back, this son of yours, he says, cutting himself off from his family, this son of yours, who's no longer any kin to me, nor will I be any kin to you if you choose him over me. And here's where the loving father earns his title. He knows that he's lost both of his sons, one to a life of recklessness and the other to a life of angry self-righteousness. That older son wants his father to love him because that's the way he deserves to be loved. But the thing is, and this is the whole point of the story, the father does not love either of his children because of what they deserve. He just loves them. And that has everything to do with who he is. It's not because of who they are. The Father just loves them with a love that transcends right and wrong and rules, with a love that throws homecoming parties for sinners, a love that expects the righteous to rejoice, with a love for one child that does not preclude loving the other child. So the father tells the older son, all I have is yours, son. You're always with me. Now come on inside and join the celebration, because this brother of yours, your brother, was dead. And he's come back to life. He was lost, and now he's found. It's an invitation for the older brother and for the righteous Pharisees and scribes and for you and me to come back into relationship, to get over ourselves, to see beyond our beliefs of what's right and proper and grasp the big picture, to see at long last that our relationships of love with one another, that's what matters most. To acknowledge our own lostness and our own experience of being found, to admit finally that none of us hold the patent on righteousness or the full breadth and depth of the truth or any claim of moral superiority, for Pete's sake. And here's what's really interesting. Jesus never says whether the older brother ever does go inside to join that party. He just leaves him standing outside listening to what's going on inside. And I'm pretty sure that's because it's up to each of us to finish this story, to decide whether we will stand outside all alone or take our place at a table full of reckless and righteous saints and scoundrels, sisters and brothers, united by our relationship to the one who does not give us the love we deserve, the one who cannot be prevented from giving us the love we need.